Iconic, forgotten, timeless, innovative. These are the soundtracks that help shape and define what we hear in the video games that we play. I am Nitro, and this is the M-Disc Playlist Video Game Music Primer 2000. Vagrant Story, composed by Hitoshi Sakamoto. Game director Yasumi Matsuno and Hitoshi Sakamoto collaborated frequently. Their most recent collaboration was Final Fantasy Tactics. But now, instead of returning to an already established franchise like Ogre or another spin-off, they were tasked with bringing a new game to life. With Final Fantasy Tactics, Sakamoto's music, while still very much dramatic, was considered by Sakamoto himself to be bright and cheerful at times. And initially, the Vagrant Story soundtrack would have matched that mood. However, Matsudo wanted the soundtrack to be more dramatic. He wanted a darker tone established through the ambient pieces, and he wanted the music to be more deep and heavy, according to an interview he did with RocketBaby. To help Sakamoto match Matsudo's vision, Matsudo referenced the score from the X-Files as a source of inspiration, second only to the guidance of Matsudo's direction. It took Sakamoto 2 years to complete this soundtrack. During the entire duration of the game's development, he was in awe with how everything came together. He even had some doubts himself over how the music could live up to the game itself. It was just as stressful as it was satisfying for him to work on this game. All the pieces in the soundtrack were composed by Sakamoto, but he did receive some support in bringing the music to life. The staff role was conducted by Kohei Haijima and performed by the Shinozaki Group, an orchestra ensemble group that also worked with Yoko Shimomura on the game Legend of Mana. Takeharu Ishimoto and Hirosato Noda helped with the synthesis programming for the piece Great Cathedral, and Hidenori Iwasaki was the main synth programmer for the opening movie piece. Vagrant Story would be Sakamoto's last score with Square before becoming a freelance composer, until becoming the founder of his own company Bass Escape in 2002. Vagrant Story would wind up being one of the original PlayStation's most successful and most memorable action role-playing games. The score would wind up being one of Sakamoto's most memorable, right up there with his previous PlayStation game, Final Fantasy Tactics. It may not have been as cheerful or as encouraging as Final Fantasy Tactics was, but perhaps that's what made Vagrant Story's score successful in the first place, the greater emphasis on the dramatic and the dark tones throughout. Wario Land 3, composed by Kozue Ishikawa. The entire plot of Wario Land 3 is that Wario is transported into a living, breathing world contained inside a magical music box. Inside that world, Wario must find smaller music boxes to not only return the world to its normal state, but to help Wario return to his own world. Of course, this game had to be included in the VGM primer. It's a game where you're trapped inside a music box, and its composer, Kozue Ishikawa, already had a great resume with Nintendo. In addition to working on the Wario Land series, she was also one of the composers for The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, her first score, the Nintendo 64 version of Mario Tennis, and Star Fox 2, which was never officially released until its inclusion in the Super Nintendo Classic Edition mini-console. Ishikawa's music was simple, yet whimsical. It didn't rely on a continuous melody. Instead, the music sounded more like simple riffs, with a melody in the background rather than the foreground. Snippets of silence were heard in between each note in some of the pieces. It was something she had done in the Wario Land games, and it helped her contributions to the Link's Awakening soundtrack stand out even more. environment was emphasized more often than the stress of the platforming itself. Sadly, the year 2000 saw Ishikawa's final scores for Nintendo. After this and Mario Tennis, she left Nintendo. Wario Land 3 continued Wario's quest for treasure in a more open-world environment, driven by exploration and puzzle solving, something that, at the time, portable gaming was not really known for. But it is because of this approach to platforming that helped make Wario Land 3 one of the more successful titles in the Game Boy Color catalog. And the world within a music box would not be enhanced any greater than through a former Nintendo composer who had a knack for making music in a platforming game emphasize environment over everything else. Kirby 64 The Crystal Shard, composed by Jun Ishikawa and Hirokazu Ando. Kirby's Dream Land 2, Kirby's Dream Land 3, and this game were known by fans as the Dark Matter Trilogy. All three games were directed by Shinichi Shimomura, who got his start in the game industry working on the HAL Laboratory shooter Hyperzone. Shimomura worked as a designer and mapper for the Kirby games directed by Masahiro Sakurai, as well as the spin-offs Dream Course and Pinball Land. The Dark Matter trilogy shared a common theme, saving Kirby's home world and his friends from the evil influence of dark matter. Kirby 64 was originally in development for the ill-fated Nintendo 64 disk drive, but when the disk drive failed to sell in Japan, and failed to even be brought to international markets, Kirby 64 was converted into a game that fit in a cartridge. Once again, Hirokazu Ando and Jun Ishikawa returned to score Kirby's adventure on the Nintendo 64. While Ishikawa has been involved with the Kirby series since the very beginning with the Game Boy Dream Land, Ando has been involved with the series since the Nintendo Kirby's Adventure. In an interview with Forbes, Ando reveals how he wants the music to match the personality and traits of Kirby himself. For a character like Kirby, I feel like the most suitable type of music has a fast tempo with frantic transitions, as if the music notes themselves are dancing around. Later in the same interview, Ando states that because game music is generally repeated while playing a game, players will get tired of it if it's too simple. I think it's important for game music to be complex rather than easy to grasp. Kirby 64 also introduced some new recurring themes. The file select theme was arranged for Kirby Canvas Curse as that game's file select theme. The Ripple Star map was reused in both Kirby Superstar Ultra, Kirby Planet Robobot, and parts of the theme can be heard when fighting Morpho Knight as Adeline and Ribbon in Kirby's Star Allies. And speaking of the Ripple Star, the main theme for the world is reprised as the theme for the stage Endless Explosions in Kirby Triple Deluxe. The boss themes in Kirby 64 were meshed and arranged together to form the Yin Yarn battle theme in Kirby's Epic Yarn. And finally, the mid-boss theme was rearranged twice in Kirby and the Rainbow Curse. Once for the tank theme, and again for the piece Burning Secrets. This is also the first game where Kirby's creator, Masahiro Sakurai, voiced the character King Dedede. He would reprise the role in all the Super Smash Bros. Games King Dedede was a part of. Kirby 64 had a lot going for it. It carried the traditions of bouncy, exciting pieces to accompany Kirby and his friends. It introduced new pieces to be used in future Kirby games, and despite being a Nintendo 64 title, it did not give Kirby a full 3D environment to roam around. It was still very much a 2D game, but whether 2D or 3D, you still got the full Kirby experience. And with that Kirby experience came upbeat, exciting, fast-paced music throughout. Mega Man Legends 2, composed by Makoto Tomozawa. Mega Man Legends, or Rockman Dash in Japan, was producer Keiji Inafune's attempt to make a Mega Man game appealing to all audiences while adding gameplay elements from multiple genres and bringing the story to life through animation and voice acting. The first game in this series became more of a cult hit when compared to the more successful Classic series and X series, but the success was enough for a second game to be made. Both Legends games were composed by Makoto Tomozawa. His experience with the Mega Man games were Mega Man X and Mega Man 7. After the Legends games, he would come back to the series for Mega Man 10. Various fan wikis state that he also worked on Mega Man Dr. Wily's Revenge for the Game Boy, but in an interview with Dash Republic's OKeijiDragon, he states that his first game was actually the Super Nintendo version of Disney's Aladdin, which was released after Dr. Wily's Revenge. Like the first Mega Man Legends game, which used Tchaikovsky's Waltz of the Flowers and Bach's Little Fugawe and Air in the G string, Legends 2 takes direct inspiration from classical music for parts of its soundtrack. The music heard in the Sulphur Bottom is an arrangement of Antonio Vivaldi's Spring. In Japan, the ending theme is the vocal piece Night Lee Yo, performed by Fumina Hara. Fumina Hara is arguably most famous for being the second actress to take on the role of Sailor Moon for the Sailor Moon musicals. Over in the West, in a very common practice at the time, the vocal piece was replaced by an instrumental piece. Mega Man Legends 2 was a bigger successor to the original in every way. Its cliffhanger ending may not sit well with fans who are still understandably upset over the fate of Mega Man Legends 3. However, despite the end, Mega Man Legends 2 is still considered an improved cinematic experience with some fun, exciting, and sometimes atmospheric music to accompany Mega Man Volnut on his open-world journey. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, composed by Koji Kondo and Toru Minegishi. After Ocarina of Time, it seemed like the bar was set to unprecedented heights with the Zelda series. Both the game and the music are still regarded as being the best the Zelda series had to offer, but with such accolades comes debates. It was either Ocarina of Time that was Nintendo 64's best Zelda title, or this one, Majora's Mask. To even compare to Ocarina of Time, director Eiji Onuma decided on a 3-day system. The 3-day system counts down 3 days in game time, converted to almost an hour in real time. After the 3rd day, the moon, under the curse of Majora's Mask, destroys the world. Ocarina of Time used music to help enhance Link's abilities and to help him navigate through dungeons. Music use in Majora's Mask is more dire than in previous Zelda games. On top of giving Link the necessary skills needed to progress, music is used to help manipulate time, to help make things easier to save Link's progress, and to help return Link to the first day of the moon's descent to the world. Time travel and manipulation through music creates a newfound sense of urgency that did not exist in any Zelda title before, nor was it replicated in future Zelda titles. In addition to music, Link relies on masks from Ocarina of Time's mask salesman in a much larger role than his previous appearance to help navigate through dungeons, puzzles, to help converse with the town citizens through different perspectives, and to play instruments unique to their masks. For example, the Deku mask grants Link the ability to play the Deku pipes. The Goron mask grants Link the ability to play bongo drums. And the Zora mask grants Link the ability to play a guitar. Majora's Mask would also be the first Zelda game with musical contributions by Toru Minegishi, who would eventually succeed Koji Kondo as the primary composer for the Zelda series. In Majora's Mask, Minegishi composed all of the battle themes except for the final battle themes. Minegishi had been inspired by the original Legend of Zelda game as well as the general talents of Koji Kondo, and he had wanted to work with video games since he was young. He joined Nintendo working in bits on the Nintendo 64. It wasn't until the GameCube came along where Minegishi was truly able to showcase his talents. One of the most memorable nostalgia music trips in Majora's Mask is the return of the Hyrule Field theme, which was omitted in Ocarina of Time's soundtrack. It was brought back for this game, adding a section unique to Majora's Mask that further enhances the urgency created by the game's 3-day system. Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time are frequently debated over which is the better Zelda title between the two. Without question, Majora's Mask is regarded as one of the darker Zelda titles that provided more of a haunting, ominous experience that wasn't attempted before or replicated later. This game also required the Nintendo 64 expansion pack due to the sheer size of what Majora's Mask was capable of. Only 3 Nintendo 64 games required the expansion pack. This one, Donkey Kong 64, and the next game to be highlighted in this episode. Perfect Dark. Composed by Grant Kirkhope, David Klinik, and Graham Norgate. After the success of GoldenEye, Rare sought to develop another Bond game based off the 1997 movie Tomorrow Never Dies. However, Electronic Arts acquired the rights to the James Bond franchise and developed Tomorrow Never Dies for the PlayStation. But that did not slow director Martin Hollis down. In fact, losing the rights to the James Bond franchise only helped motivate them into making a spiritual successor to GoldenEye, due to the time already invested in the new project. Instead of modern-day China and Britain, the setting was a sci-fi world. Instead of James Bond, the main protagonist is female operative Joanna Dark, voiced by Rare composer Evelyn Fisher. The anime film Ghost in the Shell and the television show X-Files helped shape the world and the cast of Perfect Dark into something that played like GoldenEye, but was nothing like any story that could be told in the James Bond universe. Graham Norgate was originally supposed to be the primary composer of Perfect Dark, but was only able to contribute a small number of pieces to the game due to leaving Rare for Time Splitters developer Free Radical Design. The primary composer role went to Grant Kirkhope, who was no stranger to Rare's success on the Nintendo 64 and had worked with the staff before while working on the GoldenEye soundtrack. But Kirkhope was a very busy composer, also being assigned to the games Donkey Kong 64 and Banjo-Tooie, so he assigned the task of composing Perfect Dark's cinematic pieces to Rare's newest composer at the time, David Klinik. This would be Klinik's first Rare game he worked on, as well as the only Nintendo game he worked on. All his works for Rare after Perfect Dark came after Microsoft acquired the company. Perfect Dark was only the latest addition to Rare's ever-growing successful titles to land on the Nintendo 64. Due to the expansion pack requirement, it would also be their biggest undertaking. Once again, Kirkhope helped contribute a memorable soundtrack to the Nintendo 64, and once again, the Nintendo 64 was home to an unforgettable first-person shooter experience.
Jet Rhino Radio!
Composed by Hideaki Naganuma. It wasn't just Naganuma's original score that brought this vibrant game to life. It was his recruitment of music that fit the various genres that were hitting their strides around the time of this game's release that helped bring Jet Set Radio to life, both the literal game and the in-game pirate radio station in Tokyoto. Music artists from across the globe, spanning an eclectic list of genres, were tapped on to enhance the experience of tagging your turf with graffiti. Artists like BB Wrights, Castle Logical, David Soul, F. Fields, Guitar Vader, Idle Taxi, Reps, Richard Jacques, and Toronto. There were even some artists that were exclusive to the region the games were released in. In the PAL region, Futurecast, OB1, and Semi-Detached were part of the soundtrack. In the US, Cold, Professor Murder Music, and Rob Zombie were part of the soundtrack. In both the US and PAL regions, the bands Jurassic 5 and Mixmaster Mike were part of the soundtrack. As for the composer himself, Hideaki Naganuma had a knack for music since he started playing the electric organ at the age of 5. In the 90s, he worked as a bartender and DJ in one of Japan's famous jazz venues, Blue Note Tokyo. But his ambitions were greater than that. He wanted to make contributions to the music industry, sending demos to Epic Sony Records, and he sent demos to the company that would eventually hire him, Sega. He started on the Sega Saturn as a voice editor for the Revolutionary Girl Utena video game. It was his only Saturn game before being the composer for various Dreamcast games leading up to the release of Jet Set Radio. Outside of video games, his works can be heard in two well-known anime. He remixed Captain Stratum's Fusengamu for the first ending theme of the anime Gintama, and he wrote the tracks Love Sensation and Sky Too High under the alias Skankfunk for the anime Air Gear. Jet Set Radio was one of the Dreamcast's most standout titles. In an age where nearly every game had to be third-dimensional, it was very rare at the time for a game to emphasize cell shading in its graphics. The music was very modern, appropriate to the graffiti gang culture of modern times, and it enhanced the world and gameplay experience of making Tokyoto your own personal canvas. Final Fantasy IX, composed by Nobu Uematsu. Final Fantasy IX was billed as the game that went back to its roots. Everything about 9 was a complete 180 on what defined 7 and 8. 9 was more fantasy than realistic, with homages to older Final Fantasy titles in nearly every corner. To help enhance the more simple approach to Final Fantasy, director Hiroyuki Ito encouraged a much smaller quantity of pieces. Instead, Uematsu composed 160 pieces for the game. The mood Uematsu tried to capture in this soundtrack was a medieval theme. Uematsu traveled to Germany during the development of Final Fantasy IX and was able to find inspiration through visiting old castles. He was also able to find inspiration listening to ABBA's Greatest Hits album, according to his interview with Weekly Famitsu conducted before the game's release in Japan. Not every single piece fit the medieval theme though. Uematsu was still able to think outside the box in terms of his music styles, more so than he could in previous Final Fantasy games. As part of 9's attempt to be a callback to the earlier Final Fantasy games, the volcano theme from the first Final Fantasy was arranged for this game, as well as the Castle Pandemonium theme from Final Fantasy II. The piece Doga and Une from Final Fantasy III is brought back if certain conditions relating to the Treno auction house are met. And perhaps the most obvious callback to the earlier Final Fantasy games were the lead-ins to the random encounters in the game. Every Final Fantasy game except 7 and 8 had the same intro for their random encounter themes. It didn't matter what the actual battle theme was, the intro would still be the same. Unique to this soundtrack is the leitmotif of main antagonist Kuja. When other major antagonists had very sweeping epic pieces or haunting moods to invoke fear, Kuja relied only on a very minimalist approach to having music describe who he is. The game's main theme is Melodies of Life, performed in English and Japanese by Emiko Shiratori. Uematsu discovered Shiratori through a vocal arrangement of Epona's theme from The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time that was done for an official rearrangement album in Japan. Melodies of Life is also the main leitmotif of the entire game, with variations of the song being heard throughout, most notably being the song Princess Garnet aka Dagger sings to herself. In 2006, the song was performed at the Voices Music from Final Fantasy concert. This performance is described by Uematsu as being the definitive version of the song. It begins with the opening piece, A Place to Call Home, leading into the song itself, which combines both the English and Japanese lyrics. Nobu Uematsu continues to raise the bar and change the landscape of how music in role-playing games should sound. The soundtrack has been described by Uematsu in interviews and in the soundtrack liner notes as being his favorite soundtrack in the Final Fantasy series. As time progressed after 9's release, we would soon learn that 9 would wind up being the last Final Fantasy game Uematsu would compose by himself. Skies of Arcadia, composed by Tatsuyuki Maeda and Yutaka Minobe. What do you get when you combine the members of Team Andromeda, whose last game at that point was the widely successful Panzer Dragoon Saga for the Sega Saturn, and members of the original Phantasy Star development team? You get a role-playing game akin to the Nintendo-era role-playing games about a group of air pirates who are joined together with one objective in mind: to stop the Valen Empire from conquering the world. Most of the soundtrack is composed by Yutaka Minobe, whose first game as a composer was this game. He learned how to play the piano by himself at the age of 4, and was learning how to compose his own music at the age of 8. He joined Sega in 1996, working as a sound effect designer and arranger for the original Sakura Taisen. When the Dreamcast came around, he was a piano player for the pieces in the game Sonic Adventure. The more experienced Tatsuyuki Maeda has been composing for Sega since Sonic the Hedgehog 3 in 1994. The only known bio on him as of this production is that he studied the electric organ in school. Most of the soundtrack is heavily orchestrated. There are a few pieces that are more electric than orchestrated, like Vice's theme and a few of the game's battle themes. When the Dreamcast flopped, the game was re-released on the Nintendo GameCube as Skies of Arcadia Legends. The re-release adds new features, quests, additions to the storyline, and the online content from the Dreamcast was immediately available on the GameCube. But the soundtrack in the GameCube release unfortunately suffers from downgraded quality issues when compared to how the music sounded on the Dreamcast. Whether played on the Dreamcast or the GameCube, Skies of Arcadia is still regarded as one of the greatest role-playing games released by Sega, with soundtrack from gifted musicians who learned at an early age. It may not have been a commercial success, but it is still regarded as one of Sega's best additions to the role-playing genre. Phantasy Star Online, composed by Hideaki Kobayashi, Fumi Kumatani, and Kenichi Tokoi. In 1997, Ultima Online was released for the PC. The producer of the game, Richard Garriott, described the game as being a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, an MMORPG if you will, the first time that subgenre was coined. Fast forward to 3 years later, with the release of Phantasy Star Online, a home console's first attempt at pulling off an MMORPG. Online gaming was hitting its stride in the Western market, but online gaming was almost exclusive to computers, and in the Japanese market, computer gaming wasn't nearly as popular, so the decision was made to make Phantasy Star Online a console experience to tap into the online gaming market through the consoles. Phantasy Star Online was supported officially until the final official servers went offline in 2010. Over the course of the next 10 years, we would see expansions to the game in the form of Final Fantasy Online Episode 2, Episode 3 Card Revolution, and Blue Burst. Episodes 1 and 2 was released on the Dreamcast, GameCube, Xbox, and PC. Episode 3 Card Revolution was released on the GameCube, and Blue Burst was an enhanced PC port of Episodes 1 and 2, which also contained Episode 4. The music was shared mostly between Hideaki Kobayashi and Fumi Kumatani. Kumatani started playing piano when she was 3, and according to her, insisted on taking piano lessons at that age. She joined Sega in 1995, working on games like Nights into Dreams and Burning Rangers. She was one of the composers for Sonic Adventure, notably writing and composing the vocal themes My Sweet Passion and Lazy Days. As a composer on Phantasy Star Online, she was responsible for writing and composing one of the signature tracks, Can Still See the Light. Kobayashi, although having less experience with Sega than Kumatani, ended up being the primary composer for the Phantasy Star series, starting with this game. Before joining Sega, he played for a brass band as a teenager and demonstrated his expansive music theory knowledge and ability to experiment with different styles of music under the alias Hyde Aki as a contributor to the At MIDI albums. His pieces were more aggressive and experimental than Kobayashi's. On top of that, he wrote and composed the game's other signature theme, The Whole New World. Kenichi Tokoi didn't join the Phantasy Star Online staff until Episode 3. His music was more of a complement to what the other primary composers had already contributed. Tokoi did write and compose Episode 3's main theme, Let the Winds Blow. All three of the vocal pieces mentioned were performed by vocalist Lauren. Part of what makes the soundtrack stand out are the final battle themes for each update to the game. All the final battle themes shared one major theme in common. They all contained the word Idola in the title. Pray for Idola the Distorted, cry for Idola the Holy, Idola have the Immortal Feather, Idola have the Divine Blade, Idola the Strange Fruits, and Idola the Fantastic Viper. All Idola battle themes except Strange Fruits were composed by Kobayashi. Strange Fruits was composed by Tokoi. Idola, as used in Phantasy Star Online, is heavily implied to represent the aberration of Phantasy Star's signature antagonist, Dark Falls. Phantasy Star Online was one of the biggest innovations to the console gaming experience, paving way for how games on consoles could be developed and updated for years to come. The composers enhanced the entire experience through the traditional methods of composing music for role-playing games, as well as experimental methods. Experimental methods rarely heard in video games at the time of the game's first release. And that concludes the 2000 Video Game Music Primer. Follow, like, and/or subscribe on YouTube, Twitter, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and your preferred RSS feed, all under MDisc Playlist. For updates on future, current, or archived MDisc Playlist projects, check out my blog at mdiscplaylist.blogspot.com. I am Nitro, good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.